What if I told you that avoiding a wedding ring used to make you an enemy of the state? For centuries, empires and local governments viewed single men and women not as independent citizens, but as selfish tax evaders who needed to be broken. We have gathered 50 genuinely dumb historical laws created specifically to torment, bankrupt, and publicly humiliate unmarried people. You are about to see exactly what lengths authorities went to just to stop you from enjoying the single life. 1. In ancient Sparta, avoiding marriage wasn't just frowned upon, it was treated as a severe crime against the military state. Bachelors were legally forced to strip completely naked and march through the central public square during the freezing winter months. While shivering in the ice and snow, these unmarried men had to sing a deliberately humiliating song, loudly confessing that they rightfully deserved this brutal punishment for dodging their civic duty to create future soldiers. It was the ultimate state-sponsored public shaming. 2. Emperor Augustus decided that single men in ancient Rome had it far too easy, so he enacted the Lex Papia Poppaea to hit them where it hurts most. Unmarried men between 20 and 60 were legally barred from receiving inheritances or legacies from anyone outside their immediate family. The government just confiscated the money. Augustus essentially weaponized greed to force bachelors to the altar. 3. King William III of England was desperate for cash to fund his costly war with France, so he turned the country's unmarried population into a giant piggy bank. In 1695, Parliament passed the Marriage Duty Act, effectively slapping a heavy recurring tax on bachelors over 25 and childless widowers. The richer you were, the more you paid for your solitary lifestyle. Even wealthy dukes weren't exempt, forced to hand over astronomical fees just to maintain their bachelor status without government harassment. 4. A Pennsylvania state representative in 1911 believed that staying single was a luxury that required proper government documentation. He introduced a bill requiring all bachelors to purchase a literal license to remain single. The cost of this permit was an astronomical $200 per year, which was a massive fortune at the time. It was essentially a punishment for avoiding the altar. Would you hand over a massive chunk of your yearly salary just to maintain a government-certified license to sleep alone? 5. In early colonial Connecticut, living alone as a bachelor was considered a highly suspicious and legally forbidden act. Puritan leaders firmly believed that an unattached man left to his own devices was practically an invitation for the devil. To solve this, town councils forced single men to board with established, respectable families so their daily habits could be heavily monitored for any sinful behavior. You couldn't even enjoy the peace of an empty house without the local government assuming you were up to no good. 6. To bring things into the modern era with a genuinely bizarre twist, let's look at recent laws in the Philippines. Several municipalities, including towns in the Quezon province, have officially enacted local ordinances granting paid heartbreak leave specifically for unmarried government employees who have just been dumped. If a single person goes through a devastating breakup, they can legally take up to 3 days of paid time off to sit at home and recover emotionally without losing a dime of salary. Honestly, isn't state-sponsored emotional recovery the best bachelor law ever? 7. In the 1930s, American laws targeted singlehood from a completely reverse, yet equally invasive angle. During the Great Depression, many U.S. school districts instituted strict marriage bars for female teachers. If an unmarried female teacher decided to get married, she was instantly and legally fired from her job. The government argued that married women didn't need the income since they had husbands, meaning countless women were forced into mandatory bachelorhood just to keep their teaching careers alive. They literally had to choose between true love and paying rent. 8. Mussolini completely purged local governments of anyone who preferred to sleep alone. A strict royal decree was issued in 1931, stating that every single town mayor, known as a podestà, was legally required to have a wife. If a sitting mayor was a bachelor, he was immediately fired from his prestigious position, regardless of how successfully he had been running the municipality. The regime firmly declared that a man without a wife inherently lacked the moral authority to govern other citizens. Would you risk losing your hard-earned political career simply because you hadn't bought an engagement ring? 9. Michigan lawmakers in 1901 took the bachelor tax concept to a genuinely insulting new level by proposing a bill based entirely on physical appearance. The absurd logic stated that handsome men who remained single were willfully depriving women of good husbands, so they deserved the absolute highest tax bracket. Meanwhile, men who were deemed physically unattractive would pay significantly less. Who exactly was going to sit on the official government committee evaluating the attractiveness of local bachelors to determine their tax rate? 10. The ancient Aztecs had absolutely zero tolerance for unmarried men wanting to party. Under Aztec law, drinking the fermented agave beverage known as pulque was strictly reserved for the elderly or married men who had already proven their worth to the community. If a young bachelor was caught secretly drinking alcohol, the punishment wasn't a simple fine or a slap on the wrist. He faced devastatingly severe legal consequences that would ruin his life. The state believed single men lacked the discipline required for intoxication. You could literally lose your entire social standing and freedom just because you wanted to enjoy a drink without having a wife at home. 11. In 1922, Argentina decided single men were a luxury the country could no longer afford, so they slapped a heavy tax on bachelors to fund state pensions. The backlash was instantaneous and spectacular. Single men didn't just quietly pay up and accept their fate, they literally unionized. They formed a massive Bachelors Syndicate, organizing fierce public protests, writing angry political manifestos, and threatening a nationwide strike against marriage itself. It remains one of the few times where staying single became a fiercely organized political movement. 12. Even the mighty Julius Caesar had absolutely zero patience for wealthy citizens avoiding family life. In 46 BC, he passed strict laws specifically targeting unmarried and childless women of high social status. If a Roman woman reached the age of 45 without securing a husband or producing children, she was strictly forbidden from wearing pearls or riding in luxurious litters through the city. It was a brilliant psychological tactic. If you wouldn't give the empire citizens, the empire would publicly strip away your absolute favorite status symbols. 13. Wyoming politicians in 1921 crafted a bachelor tax bill with an incredibly spiteful twist. Any man who remained unmarried would be heavily taxed, and the revenue wouldn't go to schools or roads. Instead, the money was designed to be directly paid out to local spinsters as a financial apology. The logic was that since these men had selfishly failed to propose, they owed financial compensation to the women they left on the shelf. Can you imagine the government legally forcing you to pay alimony to local women you never even took out on a date? 14. In the mighty Inca Empire, being single wasn't just heavily taxed, it was physically impossible. Marriage was strictly mandatory and ruthlessly organized by the state. Once a year, local officials would line up all the unmarried men and women in the village square. If you hadn't managed to find a partner on your own by a certain age, the government would just point at someone and declare you legally wed. You simply walked into the square single and walked out with whoever the government decided was your permanent roommate, with absolutely no way to opt out. 15. Prussia had a remarkably greedy approach to unmarried men, enforced through a legal doctrine known as the Hagestolzenrecht. Under this harsh, medieval law, a lifelong bachelor had absolutely no right to pass his wealth on to his friends, nephews, or siblings. The moment he died, his entire estate, money, and property were instantly seized by the local lord or the state. It was a ruthless way to ensure that wealth never stayed in the hands of the stubbornly independent. If you refused to produce a legitimate heir, your life savings became a mandatory donation. 16. During the French and Indian War in 1756, the colonial government of Maryland desperately needed funds for military defense. Instead of a general tax, they specifically targeted unmarried men over the age of 25. The government argued that since bachelors had no dependents and supposedly spent all their money on frivolous luxuries, they were the absolute perfect demographic to fund the militia. The tax was based heavily on total estate value, turning every wealthy bachelor into an involuntary military sponsor just because he wanted to stay out of the dating pool. 17. In 1941, dictator Francisco Franco established a brutal bachelor tax in Spain that actually lasted for decades. To combat a declining population after the Spanish Civil War, Franco penalized unmarried men and women between the ages of 25 and 50 with an aggressive income surcharge. The money extracted from these single citizens was directly funneled into state subsidies for large government-approved families. Franco made it painfully clear: if you weren't producing children for the regime, you were permanently paying for someone else's. 18. The Han Dynasty in ancient China placed an unbearable financial burden on families with unmarried daughters. Emperor Hui decreed that if a woman remained single between the ages of 15 and 30, her family's standard poll tax would be drastically multiplied. The severe penalty was meant to force parents into arranging marriages as early as possible to avoid complete financial ruin. Parents were known to rush into terrible marital agreements simply because they couldn't afford the massive luxury of waiting for a genuinely good match for their children. 19. You might think the French Revolution was all about glorious liberty and equality, but that freedom absolutely did not apply to bachelors. In 1795, the newly formed revolutionary government implemented a heavy tax strictly on unmarried men over the age of 30. Despite overthrowing a monarchy in the name of human rights, the new republic quickly decided that single men were acting selfishly. They believed true patriots owed the state children, and if a man refused to marry, his wallet would bleed for the republic instead. 20. In 1899, a California legislator introduced a brilliantly chaotic bill proposing a massive tax on bachelors, but it included a hilarious escape clause. A single man could be entirely exempted from the tax if he could legally prove that he had proposed to a woman of good character and she had rejected him. You literally had to present a sworn affidavit of your romantic failure to the state tax board. 21. Late-night walks were strictly forbidden for unattached men wandering around colonial New England. Town officials firmly believed that a bachelor prowling the dark streets was a massive threat to public morality and community safety. Several strict Puritan communities enacted specific 9 o'clock curfews that applied exclusively to unmarried men. If a watchman caught a bachelor enjoying the moonlight without a wife waiting at home, he was immediately arrested and thrown into the local lockup until morning. You literally couldn't step outside your own front door at night without being legally treated like a dangerous criminal. 22. Rejecting a marriage proposal in early 20th century Kansas almost became a grueling physical punishment. A furious state legislator introduced a bill demanding that any bachelor who turned down a woman's romantic proposal be immediately sent to a state-run rock-crushing camp. Lawmakers wanted to force single men to perform exhausting, back-breaking manual labor for the government as direct penance for breaking a woman's heart. It was a massive escalation from simple heartbreak to state-sponsored imprisonment. 23. When the Republic of Texas was struggling with massive debts in 1837, the newly formed government desperately needed a quick financial bailout. Instead of taxing businesses, they passed a sweeping law targeting their unmarried male citizens. Every single man in Texas was suddenly hit with a heavy poll tax specifically because they didn't have a wife. Lawmakers figured these unattached cowboys had plenty of loose cash. They literally built the foundation of the Texan economy on the backs of financially frustrated bachelors. 24. Communist Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu enacted a devastatingly strict celibacy tax starting in 1966. To force a massive population increase, the state heavily penalized any man or woman who remained single and childless past the age of 25. These individuals were ruthlessly hit with a special income tax that snatched up to 10% of their monthly wages. The government didn't care about your romantic struggles or personal preferences. If you weren't providing future workers, the state took your hard-earned cash instead. 25. In 1898, a New York politician proposed a wildly creative bachelor tax with a very specific, slightly insulting purpose. The bill demanded that wealthy single men pay a heavy annual fee, and the resulting funds would be used to build and maintain a massive, luxurious state-run home for elderly unmarried women. The underlying message was hilariously cruel. Since these men had stubbornly refused to marry these women in their youth, They were now legally obligated to financially support their retirement. 26. A Georgia lawmaker in 1907 tried to implement a bachelor tax that aggressively escalated the longer you managed to dodge matrimony. The proposed sliding scale was designed to cause maximum financial panic. At age 25, the tax was mildly annoying, but the rate drastically increased every single year you remained unmarried, peaking at an agonizingly high fee by age 50. The government essentially treated a man's single status like a worsening financial disease that required heavier and heavier penalties over time. 27. Among some ancient Germanic tribes, an unmarried man was treated as a bizarre social outcast who couldn't be trusted. Because a man's worth was entirely tied to his ability to run a household and produce future warriors, older bachelors were often stripped of their right to own prime agricultural land. If you didn't have a wife, the tribal leaders simply handed your valuable property over to a younger man who did. Your entire financial and social standing could be completely wiped out just for staying out of the dating pool. 28. A particularly invasive 1915 legislative proposal in Wisconsin sought to tax single men relentlessly, but it offered one highly embarrassing loophole. A bachelor could only escape the hefty financial penalty if he presented himself to a medical board and legally proved he was physically or mentally unfit for marriage. You basically had to go on permanent public record declaring yourself officially defective just to save a few bucks on taxes. 29. Refusing to settle down could literally destroy an entire noble bloodline under the strict rules of the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. Elite samurai lords were legally bound to marry and produce heirs to maintain their social standing and land. If a lord stubbornly remained a bachelor and fell ill, the government would mercilessly activate the law of kaiki. Upon his death, the shogunate would permanently confiscate his entire castle, strip his retainers of their rank, and completely erase his clan from the map. Can you imagine the intense pressure of knowing your bachelor lifestyle could ruin thousands of your loyal subjects? 30. A fierce 1927 legislative proposal in Delaware didn't just want a bachelor's money. It wanted to completely strip his political power. The bill suggested that any man who stubbornly remained unmarried past the age of 35 should immediately lose his legal right to vote in all state and local elections. The political logic claimed that an unattached man had absolutely no real stake in the future of the community. They literally tried to reduce single men to second-class citizens who legally couldn't participate in democracy. 31. Following the devastation of the Black Death, 15th century Florence was desperate to boost its population. The city implemented a ruthless bachelor tax that was heavily enforced by a terrifying government agency dramatically named the Officers of the Night. These officials actively hunted down wealthy single men, demanding exorbitant fees for their refusal to settle down and provide new citizens for the Republic. You couldn't just enjoy your wealth in peace. You had government agents literally prowling the streets to ensure your single lifestyle cost you an absolute fortune. 32. Throughout the 19th century United States and England, bachelors faced a terrifying legal trap known as the breach of promise to marry. If a single man casually proposed to a woman and then changed his mind, she could literally sue him in civil court. Known as heart-balm laws, these lawsuits argued that a bachelor backing out of an engagement deeply damaged the woman's public reputation and caused severe emotional distress. Juries heavily sympathized with this and often awarded massive financial payouts to the heartbroken brides-to-be. 33. In the early modern Ottoman Empire, unattached men weren't just taxed, they were legally segregated. Migrant bachelors looking for work in Istanbul were strictly forbidden from living in traditional residential neighborhoods. The government viewed single men as a direct threat to the morality of married women, forcing bachelors into heavily policed, grimy lodging houses known as bekar odaları. They were essentially quarantined in bachelor-only zones with strict evening curfews. You couldn't even rent a standard apartment simply because the state considered your single status suspicious. 34. Standing before a judge in medieval Wales meant your relationship status directly dictated your absolute legal credibility. Under traditional Welsh law, a bachelor was strictly forbidden from testifying in court against a married man. The judicial system inherently believed that an unmarried man lacked the stability, solid morals, and life experience required to tell the truth. Even if a single man witnessed a blatant crime, his testimony was completely legally void simply because he hadn't settled down. The courts practically treated bachelors like unreliable children who couldn't be trusted with serious adult matters. 35. Colonial Massachusetts had a fascinating legal concept called inveigling, specifically designed to terrify overly eager bachelors. In 1647, it became a literal crime for an unmarried man to attempt to win the romantic affections of a young woman without first getting explicit legal permission from her father. If a bachelor dared to secretly pass her a love letter or flirt with her on the street, he faced heavy fines or actual imprisonment. Flirting wasn't just socially awkward, it was a criminal offense that could land you straight in a colonial jail cell. 36. French King Louis XIV needed a massive population boom to support his endless military campaigns, so in 1666, he targeted his own government officials. He decreed that any bachelor who failed to marry by his 20th birthday was legally barred from holding any public office or military commission. Furthermore, married men who had large families were quickly granted massive lifetime tax exemptions by the crown. If you wanted to build a respectable, high-ranking political career in 17th century France, falling in love and tying the knot was the absolute ultimate legal prerequisite for getting the job. 37. In the early 1900s, city officials in Chicago became obsessed with protecting women from the perceived menace of unattached men. They implemented strict anti-flirting ordinances that allowed police officers to arrest bachelors simply for winking, whistling, or aggressively staring at women on public sidewalks. Known commonly as the ogling laws, these rules meant a single man could literally be thrown into the back of a paddy wagon just for looking at someone too intensely. Would you survive if modern cities started arresting bachelors for checking someone out? 38. During the early colonization of South America, the Spanish crown handed out massive estates to conquerors, known as encomiendas. But there was a massive legal catch for bachelors. The king absolutely did not trust unattached, wealthy adventurers running around the colonies unsupervised. So, a strict royal decree was passed. These landholders had exactly 18 months to find a wife and get married. If the clock ran out and they were still single, the crown legally confiscated their entire estate. Your whole fortune literally depended on your ability to quickly find a bride. 39. In the 1930s, the leadership of a very dark European regime implemented extreme rules regarding bachelorhood within their military ranks. Heinrich Himmler issued a strict mandate requiring his officers to marry a racially approved bride by the time they turned 30. If an officer stubbornly decided to remain a bachelor, he faced intense career stagnation or outright expulsion from the elite ranks. The state wasn't just managing their military duties. They were legally enforcing a terrifying, state-sponsored breeding program where being single was a dereliction of duty. 40. In many traditional Slovenian villages, unmarried men faced a grueling community punishment known as dragging the log. If the village went through the entire winter without a single wedding taking place, the local bachelors were collectively blamed for their lack of romantic initiative. On Shrove Tuesday, these single men were legally required to chop down a massive pine tree and physically drag the heavy log through the town streets while the entire village ruthlessly mocked them. It was exhausting physical labor legally mandated simply because the boys failed to propose. 41. We already know Sparta made bachelors freeze in the town square, but the social restrictions went much further. Older unmarried men were legally stripped of their right to attend the famous gymnastic exhibitions where the youth performed. In a society obsessed with athletic prowess and military strength, being banned from these prestigious sporting events was a devastating social blow. The government's logic was that since these men hadn't contributed children to the state's military machine, they absolutely did not deserve the privilege of watching the future soldiers train. 42. In ancient Rome, remaining an unmarried woman was legally impossible without essentially becoming property. Roman law dictated that single women must always remain under the strict legal guardianship of a male relative. They couldn't sign contracts or make independent financial decisions. However, there was one wildly extreme loophole: becoming a Vestal virgin. By taking a strict vow of celibacy and serving the state religion, a woman was finally legally emancipated from male control. You basically had to join a high-pressure religious cult just to get basic financial independence. 43. During the Middle Ages, powerful trade guilds completely controlled the lives of their unmarried apprentices. A young bachelor training to be a blacksmith or a carpenter wasn't just learning a trade. He was essentially property. Guild laws strictly forbade these single men from marrying before their long apprenticeships were over, which could take up to a decade. Furthermore, these bachelors were subjected to brutal nightly curfews, often locked inside their masters' houses at 8 o'clock sharp. You basically had to surrender your entire 20s to the guild for a job. 44. In 16th century Milan, local magistrates believed that well-dressed bachelors were a massive hazard to the stability of local marriages. They enacted specific sumptuary laws that strictly regulated exactly what unmarried men were allowed to wear in public. Bachelors were banned from wearing flashy silk garments, expensive jewelry, or excessively bright colors. The legal fear was that a dangerously handsome, sharply dressed single man might effortlessly seduce the wives of the wealthy elite. Imagine the police forcing you to dress poorly just because you were single. 45. Lawmakers in Montana passed a bizarre law in 1921 requiring every bachelor in the state to pay a $3 annual tax just for being single. That might sound like pocket change today, but back then it was a noticeable annoyance. The most incredible part of this legislation was where the money went. The revenue generated from these proudly unattached men was legally earmarked to fund the state's orphanages. You essentially had to pay a subscription fee to remain single, and that money directly supported children you didn't have. 46. In rural France, older bachelors who finally decided to marry faced a terrifying, legally tolerated form of mob justice known as the charivari. If an old bachelor married a much younger woman, the village youth felt robbed of a potential bride. They would surround the bachelor's house at midnight, violently beating pots, blowing horns, and screaming insults. Local authorities legally allowed this deafening harassment to continue for days until the exhausted bachelor finally paid a massive financial ransom to the mob. Your wedding night was essentially hijacked by jealous neighbors. 47. Ancient Athens featured a terrifying legal procedure called the graph agamou, which literally translates to a formal prosecution for celibacy. If a citizen remained unmarried for too long, he didn't just face a faceless tax collector. Any other citizen could physically drag him to court. Nosy neighbors essentially acted as self-appointed romantic prosecutors. If a jury found the man guilty of chronic bachelorhood, penalties ranged from heavy financial fines to a permanent loss of certain civic rights and voting privileges. 48. In 1619, the Virginia Company realized their new colony was full of rowdy bachelors and desperately needed stability. They shipped over dozens of young women to act as brides, but it came with a brutal legal catch. If a colonial bachelor wanted to marry one of these newly arrived women, he was legally mandated to pay a massive debt of 120 pounds of premium tobacco to cover her travel expenses. The government essentially created a state-sponsored bride marketplace, burying desperate single men in massive agricultural debt the moment they said "I do." 49. Scholars working at elite English universities like Oxford and Cambridge faced a ruthless ultimatum regarding their love lives. For centuries, university statutes strictly mandated absolute celibacy for all resident teaching fellows. If a brilliant professor decided he wanted to get married, he was instantly and legally stripped of his prestigious academic position and evicted from his university housing. The academic elite firmly believed that a wife would dangerously distract a man from his deep intellectual pursuits. You had to permanently sacrifice your romantic life just to keep your job as a highly respected college professor. All right, we have covered 49 wild ways the government tried to ruin the single life, leaving just one final entry. But before number 50, it is time for the final verdict. The award for the absolute dumbest rule goes to the 1901 proposal in Michigan to tax bachelors based on their physical appearance. The idea that a government committee would legally rate the hotness of local single men to decide their tax bracket is pure comedy. Do you agree with this verdict? Let us know in the comments. And now, our final number. 50. In 19th century Ireland, bachelors faced the unstoppable wrath of the Skellig lists. Because local traditions forbade marriages from taking place during Lent, any bachelor who failed to secure a bride before Ash Wednesday became a massive public target. Local poets would legally publish humiliating, satirical lists matching up the town's remaining bachelors and spinsters, openly mocking their physical flaws and romantic failures. The poems insisted these singles must travel to the desolate, rocky island of Skellig Michael to repent for staying single. It turns out the easiest way to unite politicians across history was a shared hatred for anyone without a wedding ring. So, here is a question for you. Does the government ever actually have the right to legislate your romantic life? Or should politicians permanently stay out of our personal relationships? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to smash that like button, subscribe for more crazy historical rules, and I will see you in the next video.